Okay, seeing some participants trickle in, I'm going to welcome you all today to sharing the benefits and costs distributional equity analysis of utility investments. My name is Lily Smith, and I'm excited to host Julie Michaels of E for the Future, Alice Napoleon of Synapse Energy Economics, Wally Nixon of the Arkansas Public Service Commission, and Will Bryan, SEEA's Director of Research. For leading the conversation today surrounding distributional equity analysis in utility investments. Before we hop into it and I switch things over to our moderator this afternoon, Wally Nixon, I've got to give a little bit of a SEEA spiel. SEEA helps advance the equitable transition to a cleaner economy through workforce development and supporting energy and security in 11 southeastern states and 5 island territories. We do so through research, consultation and education, stakeholder facilitation, program management, and financial services, which we provide to a range of stakeholders in the energy sector. And now I'm going to go ahead and read off Wally Nixon's bio. Okay. Wally Nixon has served since 2006 as the Commissioner's legal aide and now Chief Counsel for the Arkansas Public Service Commission, focusing primarily on energy efficiency, demand response, including ARC's issues, IRP, and more recently, distributed energy resources and net metering policy. Wally has had primary responsibility at the APSC for shepherding the Commission's energy efficiency rulemaking and utility program implementation processes, and has been the Commissioner's principal advisor regarding the adoption of revisions to its net metering rules to implement legislative changes adopted in 2015, 2019, and 2023. He has also led the Commissioner's staff's development of APSC DER investigation docket and its collaborative activities on the subject. Before his work at the Arkansas Public Service Commission, Wally has had extensive past working for Energy Services Incorporated, the Arkansas Attorney General's Office as Director of Energy Conservation and Rate Advocacy, and in the Arkansas Department of Energy. Wally also serves as a vice chair of the NARUC Staff Subcommittee on Energy Resources and the Environment. Wally, I'll invite you to go ahead and take it away.
All right. Well, thank you. I don't have much of an introduction of my remarks other than just to say thanks for inviting me to participate as moderator of this, and I will have very little to say. I will introduce our speakers. My background does include a lot of activity in the years when I was at Entergy on low-income programming, and so the equity issue has always been top of mind for me in many ways. So let me introduce our speakers and we'll get started. Will Bryan is an award-winning researcher and environmental educator with more than a decade of experience researching, writing, and teaching about a range of climate and environmental policy issues. At SEEA, he serves as the Director of Research, where he leads a research portfolio focused on equitable energy policies across SEEA's 11-state region. Will led SEEA's work to build engaging research products focused on energy insecurity, efficient energy and health, and housing issues, among others. Alice Napoleon is a principal associate at Synapse Energy Economics. She conducts technical and economic analyses of energy and environmental issues regarding energy efficiency, energy justice, alternative regulatory mechanisms, and the future of fossil gas. In her 18 years at Synapse Energy Economics, she has led major projects for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation on policy interventions to improve energy justice, for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency on quantifying the benefits of clean energy resources, energy efficiency potential, and low-income energy efficiency efforts, and for the U.S. Department of Energy to facilitate integration of strategic energy management platforms onto utility portfolios. Ms. Napoleon has provided testimony before public utility commissions across the United States and Canada on a range of issues, including low-income energy efficiency services and implementation of advanced metering infrastructure. She is currently working with clients in several states to address regulatory challenges related to fossil gas utility systems in carbon-constrained settings. She's lead author of Distributional Equity Analysis for Energy Efficiency and Other Distributed Energy Resources, which is the forthcoming guidance document for utilities, regulators, and other actors to understand equity impacts of investments in distributed energy resources. And that, of course, is the subject of our talk today from both of them. So let's get started with Will, and I'll turn it over to him.
Great. Thanks, Wally. Really great to be here and to talk about the subject. I think it's incredibly important for the Southeast. It's something that the South is beginning to grapple with, as we'll see. But I think there's a lot more room to engage with the ideas that Alice is going to talk through in a few minutes. So I think my role today really is to kind of set the stage a bit for that and to provide a little bit of the context kind of in our region about maybe the potential impact of these this kind of new way of assessing the impacts of the energy sector and why that is so critical. Next slide, please. So I thought I would start really by kind of setting the stage a little bit. I think it's really important when we're thinking about kind of equity and the need for really kind of assessing equity in a regimented manner to kind of understand that the South really struggles with energy inequities at a huge scale. 1 out of every 3 people in our region faces energy insecurity, which is really just difficulty meeting your house energy needs. So that means you struggle maybe from month to month to pay the bills. You struggle to keep your house warm in the winter, cool in the summer, and to maintain other kind of vital energy services. There's a number of dimensions of energy insecurity, and it's really a product of a couple of different factors. One is the kind of physical condition of the home, how efficient your home is. Is it, more efficient and cheaper to operate, or is it less efficient and more expensive to operate? Economic factors influence this a lot, primarily income. How much income do you have? And then, it kind of has a major impact on how much you have to spend for energy. And then finally, kind of behavioral factors influence energy insecurity a great deal. And that is really kind of focused on, are you having to keep your household maybe warmer than is ideal or cooler than is ideal? And that has kind of cascading factors. Next slide, please. And before we really get into it, I think it's good to kind of have a grounding in what distributional equity is, because it's really one dimension of kind of a broader concept of equity. And I've pulled these really from the DEA report that Alice is going to be talking about. So hopefully it will line up nicely with that. But really what we're going to be focused on today is distributional equity, and that's equitably distributing the benefits and burdens of energy generation, transmission, and consumption across all segments of the community and generations. So this is really kind of focused on how do we ensure that those benefits and burdens are equitably distributed, which doesn't necessarily mean equally distributed, but we'll see that in maybe some of these other elements. There are a number of factors, I think, that influence that and that are related to that. One is procedural equity, and that is ensuring that there is inclusive, accessible, and authentic engagement and representation when developing or implementing programs or policies. Basically, ensuring that those impacted have a seat at the table, and a meaningful seat at the table is vital. Recognitional equity is kind of a broader concept, recognizing that the historical, cultural, and institutional dynamics and structures that have been in place for generations have led to energy inequities and really created a situation where some groups have been burdened for a long time, whereas others haven't and have benefited. And then finally, restorative equity, which is trying to address all of this in a holistic way. So for instance, providing reparations for past inequities, rectifying practices that perpetuate these inequities, systems, and structures, and then promoting accountability from key decision makers. And all of these are really necessary. And we're going to be, I think, focused on the first today, but it's important to keep in mind that they're all really linked in key ways. Next slide. So like I said, energy insecurity is a condition that is particularly acute in the South. If you look at this map, this is a map of the proportion of households in each state that struggle with energy insecurity. And you can see that it has a little bit of a Southern accent there. The most energy insecure states as a proportion of the population are all in the South. Maybe West Virginia accepted, though we claim it sometimes as Southerners. Really ranging from kind of North Carolina and Florida, which are kind of among the lowest in the region at, about a quarter of the population who are energy insecure, to Mississippi, where about 4 out of every 10 households struggle from month to month to keep the lights on. Next slide, please. And, I think it's important to note, kind of based on those dimensions of equity that I mentioned earlier, that this is not something new. This is rooted in past policies and systems that have benefited certain groups in the South, particularly white groups in the South, at the expense of people of color. This is a map of Birmingham, Alabama. This is a home from the Homeowners Loan Corporation. It was developed in the 1930s to guide mortgage lending practices throughout the nation. And they developed maps like this for each city in the nation to kind of classify the risk of lending in that city and in kind of particular parts of the city. And so if you look at the map, you can see that neighborhoods coded in green and blue are considered kind of safe for banks to lend to people looking to, get a mortgage, whereas neighborhoods coded in red or yellow are generally deemed unsafe or risky for mortgage lending. These maps largely were developed along the basis of race, and they had major impacts. Really, they continued to impact mortgage lending practices into the 1970s. And with the result that if you were living in a predominantly Black neighborhood, you faced a much higher barrier to accessing capital for home purchases, for home improvements, and that kind of thing. And I think, this is just kind of one example of generations of policies and practices that have ensured that kind of the burdens of the energy and housing sectors have fallen most heavily on people of color, particularly in the South. Next slide. And so if you look at this is a map of energy burdens today in Birmingham, and you can essentially see that they track along the same lines as this mortgage lending map from the 1930s, with neighborhoods that were denied mortgages in the 1930s generally having significantly higher energy burdens in the neighborhood of 12% plus, 12% of your income plus. Whereas neighborhoods that were predominantly white and generally had easy access to mortgage lending have significantly lower energy cost burdens, somewhere between 1 and 6%. So these this kind of generational policies and practices continue to impact the system that we're faced with today. Next slide, please. And I think you can just see that through a couple of statistics on energy insecurity. The South, like I said, leads the rest of the nation in each of these categories, including people who have had to reduce their consumption of food and medicine to pay their energy bills. About 10 million households in the South report having to do that regularly. About 5 million households in the South are unable to use their heating and cooling equipment. About 6 million have received disconnection or stop service notifications. And then about 5 million have to keep their home in an unhealthy temperature because they cannot afford the cost of energy. Next slide, please. And I think, it's important to note that these are not just kind of affordability challenges. They have other really important ramifications, particularly on the health of people living in inefficient homes. And there's a real link between the inefficiency of somebody's home and kind of, their exposure to mold and moisture and other things that can be threats to health. Asthma in particular is very strongly associated with inefficiencies in the home. And so, if you look at this map of Atlanta, this is a map of energy use per square foot, energy use intensity on the one hand, and pediatric asthma visits to the ER. And you can see that neighborhoods in the north and east part of the city generally don't pay that much per square foot for their energy. They're more efficient housing. And they generally have pretty low asthma rates, whereas neighborhoods in the south and west part of Atlanta, both have, lots of inefficiencies in their homes and then have extremely high rates of ER visitations for pediatric asthma. And I think it's important to note that this is not necessarily a one-to-one relationship, but that these things are definitely associated with each other, and that there's a lot of research showing that improving the efficiency of a home reduces some of the biggest asthma triggers, particularly for children. Next slide, please. So when we think about this kind of holistically, I think it's just important to recognize that like the housing that we live in is infrastructure. It's a way to kind of reduce, stress on the grid and improve kind of outcomes for people living in that housing. And you can see a couple of ways here, that can be done through housing and energy interventions. I think the biggest one that I'll point out is just weatherization, which can improve energy performance and reduce health hazards, which is a boon to resilience, affordability, climate outcomes, and health as well. Next slide, please. So when we think about kind of the landscape of equity in the South, I mean, I think that is all really important context, right? That the South generally, we see systemic inequities in energy and housing that have been around for generations and that have resulted in, very different outcomes for people depending on race, income, and other characteristics. However, I think there's some like really promising trends that are kind of are taking place in maybe a scattered way across our region, but that I think maybe show that this is becoming more of a concern and that equity is being considered more systematically in the policymaking process. A couple that I'll point out, and I should note, I mean, there are not that many in the South. There's virtually no public utility commission in the region that has required equity in decision-making processes. State legislatures have been relatively slow to do that as well. But I think, we're beginning to see some changes there. And I'll note a couple of them here. I think one is Virginia. The state of Virginia in 2023 passed a law that requires the Corporation Commission to establish for Dominion Energy Virginia annual energy efficiency saving goals for customers who are considered to be vulnerable, including low-income, elderly, disabled, or veteran customers. And the goal really is to optimize energy efficiency and health and safety benefits of utility energy efficiency programs. And so to do that, there's really a need to consider a lot of the metrics that Alice is going to talk about, and to be very systematic in assessing kind of the distributional equity components of those programs. North Carolina is another state that's taken action on this front. 2 years ago, the state required that the Utility Commission both reduce kind of CO2 emissions and then, included some kind of equity considerations in that, and, some priority populations in that. And also that same year, the Utility Commission ordered Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolinas to create a stakeholder-driven process really to identify opportunities to improve affordability for low-income residential customers. And that's an ongoing process that has resulted in proposals for new programs and new ways to target Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolinas programs to make sure that they're as effective as they possibly can be. And then I'll just note, this isn't really distributional equity, this is more procedural, but I think it's important that, in Florida and South Carolina, regulators are required, particularly on rate cases and other kind of key decisions, to hold public comment sessions in various parts of the state. And at least in South Carolina, those have given communities really a chance to provide feedback on rates that has kind of rolled back some of the projected rate increases. So there's some kind of a public comment mechanism that I think is really important in that as well. So I think all of that is to say, the South has a very strong need for assessing in a very systematic way kind of distributional equity impacts and pathways forward. There are some promising trends that show that states and utility commissions are beginning to take note of that. But if you look at that, that's 3 states really. So there's still a long ways to go, and I'm optimistic that the guide that Alice and her team have created, is going to be something that can really help, chart a path forward. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Alice to talk a little bit more about what they've been working on.
Thank you so much, Will. So my name is Alice Napoleon. I'm a principal associate at Synapse Energy Economics. The presentation today is about the guidance document that is forthcoming. Will be published soon on distributional equity analysis of distributed energy resources. I'm presenting this on behalf of our team. So despite what Wally said, I'm only one of the lead authors, but I appreciate his confidence. Next slide, please. Just briefly, Synapse is a research and consulting firm. We tackle a variety of a range of energy, economic, and environmental topics. And today I'm talking mostly about energy justice. So next slide, please. So just a little bit of an agenda for my presentation to you. The purpose of this presentation is to share with you the content and methods of a soon-to-be-released guidance document about distributional equity analysis. An outline, you can see on this slide, it's an outline of the presentation. Next slide, please. So just first, I want to give a little bit of context, the purpose and the background behind this effort. So next slide. So customers in a given jurisdiction do not share the burdens of the energy systems equally. And I'm saying systems because we're including both electric systems and gas systems within that. And this is very much consistent with what Will was talking about. Thank you so much, Will. Just to highlight a few of the inequities, he mentioned energy burdens, excessive ones. So 6% is in line, a 6% energy burden, which means the percent of income that is spent on energy expenditures, generally related to energy use in the home. 6% is what is targeted by some states for energy burden as a goal, but it's often it can get up much higher than that. So 20% is not necessarily unusual for individual customers. So other inequities include limited access to distributed energy resources. I'll call those DERs, or clean energy, inadequate infrastructure to support those resources, vulnerability to environmental and public health impacts, greater risk of reliability and resilience issues, greater risk of service shutoffs, and economic or job impacts of the clean energy transition. So there is a need for a different type of analysis beyond benefit cost analysis, so BCA, to help decision makers understand whether their DER investments are equitable. And that's not just utility DER investments. We do use the term utility investments throughout this presentation. I'll say that, and also within the guide. However, these principles could be applied to other entities making those investments. Whether those investments are equitable, and states are poised to give increasing focus to this question. This is where DEA comes in. DEA is an analytical framework that separates customers into different groups and considers the equity impacts on both. This allows analysts to assess how costs and benefits will affect each group. The primary purpose of this DEA guide is to answer two key questions. That includes, what are the distributional equity impacts from utility DER investments, and how can jurisdictions incorporate those distributional equity impacts into their decision-making framework when they are doing benefit cost analysis? Next slide, please. So the forthcoming report is a outgrowth. it's a resource of the National Energy Screening Project, which would release the National Standard Practice Manual and other reports that are related to that, and tools related to benefit cost analysis for DERs. The authors of these existing products, including my colleagues at Synapse, received many requests to understand how to account for energy equity in benefit cost analysis. And that is part of the impetus of the work that I am sharing today. Next slide, please. So a little bit of a background is shown on this slide on who's been funding it. Project has been funded by and written in collaboration with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and E for the Future. Julie Michaels is with us today as one of the sponsors. Our team has been working with an advisory committee also throughout this project. It includes a diverse group of representatives of energy justice and experts in energy justice, and representatives from utilities, state agencies, and others. It also includes Will Bryan, who was talking earlier. So thank you, Will. There's a link within the slides that I understand you'll receive after the webinar that you can that if you see the link there at the bottom, see link for advisory committee members, you can click on that and you can see who participated. I do want to take a moment to make a shout out to all the people who have contributed to this effort. It's been a big effort. We're really proud of it, and we're really excited to release it. Final report will be published soon at the link on the right-hand side. Next slide, please. So this new document provides guidance on conducting DEAs alongside BCA to inform decisions regarding utility investments, DER investments. I mentioned also that it doesn't just have to be utilities. Other entities might be interested in conducting a DEA. So first and foremost, though, I think we need to talk about what is energy equity. Here's just one definition. There are a number of different definitions that folks use, different organizations use, but this one from the DOE, Department of Energy, is energy equity recognizes that disadvantaged communities have been historically marginalized and overburdened by pollution, underinvestment in clean energy infrastructure, and lack of access to energy efficient housing and transportation. There are four main pillars of equity: recognition, procedural, distributional, and restorative. Thank you so much, Will, for covering those. We do, within the guidance document, we are focused on distributional equity, although notably there are overlaps between these different dimensions of equity. We do cover, to some extent, some procedural issues because they really provide a foundation for doing a good DEA. Okay, next slide, please. So just want to give a little bit of an overview of benefit cost analysis and how it relates to DEA. DEAs can help overcome the limitations of BCAs. So what are the differences? BCAs compare total costs and benefits. Another way to think of BCA is that it looks at the impacts on average. It does not include any indication of how benefits are distributed across populations. BCAs are also can be conducted from a particular perspective, such as the utility or the participant perspective. Still, they are not usually very granular. Meanwhile, DEAs calculate costs, benefits, improvements, or added burden for different groups of customers, distinct populations. We, in this guide, call them priority populations. We did a survey of, looked at different terminology for describing populations who have been historically and continue to be burdened. And we've decided to go with equity priority populations, which notably there are different definitions or different terms for basically the same idea. Disadvantaged communities is one that's used in numerous jurisdictions. Energy justice communities, fence line communities, all of these terms come into play here. And equity priority populations, or priority populations for short, is meant to capture that. Unlike with benefit cost analysis, the impacts for DEAs do not have to be monetized. Units can vary. For example, DEAs could look at percent participation alongside dollar change in bills as a result of the program. So have different units, and we can still consider those impacts within the DEA. Next slide, please. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just talking about how a distributional equity analysis is conducted. This is going to be relatively high level given the time time limits that we have here. But like I said, there will be a forthcoming guidance document that will have a lot more information on this. Next slide, please. This slide shows the chapters in our guidance document, which aligns with the stages for conducting a DEA. The steps include establishing a community and stakeholder process, articulating the DEA context, identifying priority populations, developing DEA metrics, applying DEA metrics to priority populations, presenting and interpreting DEA results, and making resource decisions using the results from the DEA and the BCA. So just first off, you'll note the stakeholder process. I don't have a specific slide on that. However, it's really important as a foundation for the DEA. A lot of times communities will have different perspectives on they will have perspectives on their lived experience, and they will also have information about data quality and priorities. And it's really important to make that as a foundation of the DEA analysis. Resource decisions are most effective when they are when they integrate input from people who will be affected by those decisions. Those might include local community representatives, consumer advocates, environmental advocates, energy justice advocates, and other community organizations. Government agencies such as state energy offices are often a good resource for information and advice. Utility employees, managers, and investors, and other parties who intervene in related regulatory proceedings. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so after establishing the stakeholder process, the next step is to determine the DEA application. The articulating the context involves setting the goals of the DEA, the applications, and the time frame upfront, and which is a key to ensuring transparency and managing the scope of the analysis. So first, you want to ask yourself questions like, what is the purpose of your DEA? Are you looking at the impact of a single program, or are you comparing one portfolio to another to determine the best choice, or across different types of distributed energy resources? Analyses can be prospective for planning purposes, or they can be retrospective as well. So here's an example on the slide. Utility wants to analyze whether its planned energy efficiency portfolio will serve a Justice 40 defined population equitably compared to other customers. A stakeholder group refined the scope to look at a portfolio of electric energy efficiency programs serving residential customers. So based on that, we can see that the timescale it's for a planned program. So the timescale should be forward-looking, not retrospective. although you might want to draw on some retrospective data to the extent that you have that available. And, you know, just as 40 defined populations is who you're going to be focusing on. And there is a link on the slide to more examples. You can see the link at the bottom, see link for more applications and examples, which also will be included in the guidance document. Okay, next slide, please. So I talked a little bit about priority populations before, just as an intro. The next stage of the process is to identify your priority populations. Priority populations are a set of electric or gas customers who typically experience disparities or inequities relative to other customers. It is up to each jurisdiction to define and identify priority population customers. Ideally, those should reflect state energy equity goals, if any exist, or any other kind of policies, energy equity policies. Next step is to review indicators that other jurisdictions have used for priority populations. There are a number of states who are very active and have taken a lot of effort to define their priority populations. So, for example, Washington, California, New York, and there are many others as well. You want to solicit input from stakeholder representatives because sometimes the data sets that you have might have some holes in them. And so looking at the communities themselves can help to identify oversight from those data sets and other areas that you really need to consider. Choose a set of indicators based on the previous 4 steps, then conduct cumulative impact analysis. This is an optional step to identify the most highly impacted customers and consider refinements for the purpose of conducting the DEA. So, you know, one question that you might have, so over on the right side, you have other terms for priority populations, but we also, excuse me, as a part of this step, you identify indicators for what defines the priority population. So indicators can be a range of different traits. They might include language proficiency, income, education, housing condition. There are a number of other things that you might want to consider as well that are indicated. For example, vulnerable customers often include those who are medically dependent on utility services, for example. The ultimate goal is to clearly define a priority population, and you will compare that priority population for a set of metrics that I'll cover shortly to how the program benefits other customers. Defining the scope of the priority population likely requires making a trade-off. Broad scope could end up targeting many customers with great programs, but a broad scope could also lead to higher costs for customers on the margin, like moderate income customers. So that's something to consider. But it's very important to consider whether you are capturing those with the highest burdens, not just energy burden as in expenditures over income, but also those who are suffering from many negative impacts of the energy system. Guidance document provides much more information on different population characteristics and strategies for defining a priority population. Next slide, please. The next step is to develop DEA metrics. The metrics a jurisdiction chooses should be relevant to the resource being analyzed. They should represent something that can be distinctly assessed for priority populations and other customers. Strong metrics should they should focus on distributional equity. They should provide an assessment or should allow for assessment of discrete impacts. So you don't want to have a lot of overlap between metrics. So a lot of metrics that point to the same thing is not an ideal way to look at your metrics. They should be tied to equity goals or policies for the jurisdiction, and they should be impactful, particularly for the DER that's being considered. Just like BCA impacts, DEA metrics should be calculated relative to a scenario without the program, capturing the impact of the program only. Next slide, please. So this slide contains some examples of DEA metrics broken out by impact category. These can include a change in the number or duration of outages, which is mentioned here under the utility system impacts, change in frequency of shutoffs, change in various non-energy impacts. So for example, lost work days or change in health, safety, or comfort. Workplace impacts, bills, or participation. For those who are more familiar with benefit cost analysis, it may catch your attention that another core difference between BCA and DEA is that DEA metrics can be from multiple perspectives without violating the analysis. The guidance document has a lot more information on metrics and the selection process. And unfortunately, I can't go into all the detail here. Next slide, please. Next step is to apply DEA metrics to priority populations. This is probably the trickiest part of conducting a DEA, where you need to find the right data and be able to align the various data sets that you're going to use. These can be data sets from public sources like governments, or they might be sources from utilities. The ultimate goal of this step is to calculate a value for each metric separately for the priority population and for other customers. Most likely, priority population data will be geographically defined. So, for example, a census tract could be defined as a priority population, whereas equity metrics such as participation or bills might be at the address level or account level for from a utility data set. Marrying these two data sets together while maintaining data privacy is a challenge that will likely be uniquely resolved by each jurisdiction. Our guidance document provides some suggested methods and tools, including geographic information systems or GIS, to support this analysis. While this step may be frustrating for some jurisdictions starting out, it is a helpful exercise to identify data gaps with the goal to improve over time. So you can conduct DEAs over time to get better. The ultimate result is to have values for each metric for each population. For example, the priority population might have 15% participation, and the other customers might have 10% participation. All right, let's go to the next slide. DEA results can be viewed in several ways. The simple results are what we calculated with the prior step, where each metric would have one value for each population. The analysis was relatively simple, and the metrics showed generally consistent results. For example, each metric showed the priority population performed much worse than the other customers. The analyst would probably stop there and would have their answer that the program is not equitable. If the results are less straightforward, it might be helpful to benchmark the results. So you might use a target or a historical result to have some context for those simple results. It can be particularly helpful to present to a stakeholder group where members may have diverse areas of expertise and may not be as familiar with some of the chosen metrics. Finally, there's a third approach, which is to calculate weighted DEA scores. This is best suited for more complex analyses It builds scores for each metric based on the results or benchmarks using multi-attribute analysis, which I can't really take enough time to explain right now, unfortunately. This is a new concept and will require careful consideration as it is implemented in practice. Okay, so next slide, please. The last chapter of the report is about decision-making with both BCA and DEA. This simple matrix, as you see on the slide, is mainly to show that both BCA and DEA results are important for the decision-making. If the BCA passes and equity is improved, then the DER program likely should be approved. That is shown in the lighter green box. Also in the lighter green, another lighter green box, if the DER fails the BCA and equity is worsened, it's evident that that program should not go through or portfolio should not go through. The trickier questions come in when the DEA is passed, but the BCA is failed, and vice versa. In those cases, judgment will be required. Next slide, please. And that is it. So we have a little bit of time for some questions. I do want to note, as I mentioned before, there's a lot more information than I was able to cover. It will be in the forthcoming guidance document. If you have questions, though, you should feel free to reach out to me at the email address on this slide. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Alice. I see that you had a couple bonus slides. Did you want to go through those or skip them for today?
Let's skip those so we have time for questions.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to stop sharing so that we have all of our speakers on screen. For our audience members, I will encourage you to place any questions in the Q&A box. Before we hop into the Q&A, though, I do have to make one plug. Please fill out the survey that pops up after the presentations end today, or the webinar ends today, so that we can help cater content for you all. While we're waiting for any comments to come in, I am going to go ahead and proceed with some questions that I had of my own. First off, were utilities engaged in the stakeholder process for developing the metrics that are going into the DEA? Yeah, and if so, who are they?
Oh, so we did within the advisory committee, which I mentioned earlier. We did have utilities involved. There was Puget Sound Energy, who gave us some really helpful feedback. Puget Sound is out on the West Coast in Washington, and Washington is one of the leading states with conducting and considering equity within resource decision making. So that was a great help to us within that.
Okay, great. I'm looking at my notes and looking at the examples for tracking and developing the DEA metrics. If a utility is not tracked or commission has not required a utility to track certain metrics, for instance, change in workdays and lost workdays, what's the starting process for that?
That's a good question. We think of as data as a fluid resource, right? Where there are opportunities to improve data collection over time. And I think that, there's a utility or a public service commission should not take it as, what we have in hand right now is the only thing that we will ever have access to. There are opportunities for reviewing what kind of data are available and where there's room for improvement, so long as it doesn't impede privacy considerations, which definitely comes in. We talked a little bit about looking at account level data from utilities, which usually they are not able to share that outside. They can do techniques like masking the data and share it with others. So that removes things, personal identifiers like name and address and account number. Those types of things can be removed from data sets and shared. Even so, there are other reasons for rolling up a little bit with the data to protect privacy. Anyone else have anything that they wanted to share on this?
I'll just say, I mean, there is some data that like probably just isn't going to be collected by a utility, and may involve some kind of creative searching. I know, like customer data on income, for instance, isn't necessarily going to be data that a utility will collect. And so, I know there's kind of other potential for accessing data like that through kind of private providers. But so, I mean, I think, yeah, I think there are some, I think starting small and gradually expanding is sort of the key. And then thinking also just kind of outside the box, maybe a little bit about where some other sources of this data could be. Yeah.
I was going to weigh in a little bit on this. I spent 15 years with Entergy doing mostly low-income advocacy work within the company, the corporation. And at one point, the utility had always supported the funding of LIHEAP, the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, bill payment assistance for customers in Washington with the company's, governmental affairs people to increase funding and to focus on the fact that the funding formula disadvantaged states in the South, particularly just the way it was designed. And they did that, but they didn't know exactly how much the company was receiving in LIHEAP. It seems sort of odd that they wouldn't have known that it turned out to be millions of dollars. But you ask a utility, do you keep track of who your low-income customers are, and are they getting bill payment assistance from churches or from community action agencies or whatever? And they will say, no, we don't keep track of, we don't serve customers based on what their income is, so we don't keep track of that. But the CEO at the time, who has since died some years ago, wanted to know how much LIHEAP the company got across the 4 states that Entergy served in: Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, and the city of New Orleans. And I was in Arkansas, and I was trying to help figure out an answer to that question for him. And I checked with the back office people that do billing and bill payment calculations and accounting. And they said, well, we just don't have that. You're welcome to come to New Orleans and look at all of the checks that have been received from the community action agencies and third parties that might pay bills for people that need help. I said, well, that sounds like an awful lot of work to come look through boxes of checks that were paid. And so I backed up and said, let's go to the community action agencies, which do the LIHEAP work and the weatherization work. And they run the program for LIHEAP, and find out how much did they pay the company. And I was able to get the number, the dollars, but you could actually connect that, I think, to the actual census data. We're in the South, as William's maps showed. We're a very low income state in Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, all 3 in particular. And we were able to get the numbers of dollars that were paid to the company. The same could be true for any other utility. I think they could access that. The cap agencies calculated what it was and gave us those numbers. But I think you could use that to back into what the census data would show, where the low-income counties are, mostly in Arkansas. They're in the Mississippi River Delta area. So that's just my thought of one way to do that. And as a result of that, when they saw the numbers, that the bill payment assistance that were going to the utility, which of course is, I guess somebody might say it's corporate welfare, because they're getting their bills paid by the federal government, it was much easier for them to support increasing the amount of light heat nationally, and they've done that consistently ever since, and the funding has gone up.
Will, were you answering Taylor's question in the chat? I saw you were typing, but otherwise we can answer it out loud.
Why don't we
Taylor,
answer it out loud? Yeah.
Okay. Taylor asks, have you incorporated regional affordability of other essentials into guidance for assessing energy insecurity?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think we have started thinking about that because I think one thing we've realized is that these kind of standard thresholds that are often used are not necessarily good indicators everywhere. And, they're not sort of geographically tailored to the needs of a particular place or to the kind of costs of a particular place. So we've been thinking a little bit about that. We haven't really delved into it fully. But I think it's definitely something that we've started thinking about, and I think kind of pegging those thresholds to kind of other costs is a really promising strategy for starting to get a little more tailored idea of like what does I think really the question is like, what is somebody's ability to pay, which is maybe a better indication of whether you're energy insecure than like whether you pay 6% of your income or not, which for some people is a hardship and for others maybe it's not, and so I think so I think we've started to think a bit about how do we kind of make that more granular, and I think the approach you mentioned is promising. We haven't really dug into it yet, so if you've done that, I would love to hear about that and chat more about that. But yeah.
Thank you, Will. We've got a question from Douglas. Should state legislatures pass laws which require IOUs to provide data, and if so, which would be the kinds of data that should be listed?
So I'll take a shot at this. I think it's a really important question, and I'm glad you're thinking about it. I'm not sure that I can provide you with a direct enough answer within the 2 minutes that we have, but that is certainly a tool. State legislatures certainly enable data collection, or at least take away any kind of question that a PUC might have about whether they can be collecting that data. I think within most of the places that I've seen, the PUCs have assumed that they have the ability to collect data and have empowered utilities to collect certain data. But providing with legislation, with that legal mandate, that is helpful. We will get into within the guide the different kinds of data that are useful to have. You can check out some of the tools that are currently available, and those will show you some of the data types that would be helpful to have under your belt. So you can look at some of the tools. There's a tool for Washington State, which has a cumulative impact analysis, and there are a lot of different variables that go into that analysis. California also has a tool. There's the CGIST tool, which is the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. That's a federal tool that has a lot of information on it. That actually, the inputs for the CGIST, you don't need to collect as a state because the data are already available for federal, on the federal level, down to the granularity. I believe that's at the census block group. Subject to check.
Thank you, Alice. Well, we have reached our 3 o'clock hour. If y'all have any pressing comments, you're welcome to make them. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and close this out. Thank you to all of our speakers today. Alice Napoleon at Synapse Energy Economics, Wally Nixon, of course, at the Arkansas Public Service Commission, and Dr. Will Bryan, SEEA's very own Director of Research, and to all of our attendees today that are interested in learning more about distributional equity analysis. Please note that you will receive the slides and the recording in an email, date to be determined. Please be on the lookout for the guide that will be coming out, I believe Q1. Is that right, Alice?
That's our hope, although it's going to be in the DOE's hands. Department of Energy still has to review it. So
well, okay, we'll give you some slack there. But but yes, happy holidays to everybody that joined us, and please feel free to follow up with any of the people speaking today. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
thank you.
Thanks.